Good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for this edition of our Connecting California series. My name is Miguel Leon, Senior Program Manager with the Michelson 20mm Foundation. Before we get started with today's important discussion, I would like to share a bit about the foundation. Founded by Dr. Gary K. Michelson and Alia Michelson, the Michelson 20mm Foundation is dedicated to ensuring that everyone, particularly our most vulnerable populations, has the access to the equitable post-secondary educational opportunities that lead to meaningful careers. We proudly operate at the cutting edge of higher education to help forward-thinking innovators, nonprofits, and startups close the opportunity gap. Our Connecting California series is but one example of a project that launched a year ago as part of our Digital Equity initiative to increase awareness of the digital divide and opportunities to close it. The series has hosted 6 events zeroing in on a range of themes, including the history of digital inequity, root causes, potential long-term solutions, and even uplifted exemplars of public-private partnerships whose cross-sectoral efforts are making a difference for communities and people in need. Today, we are proud to bring together some of the brightest minds and most forward-thinking leaders in this work with race and digital inequity, the impact on poor communities of color. Of all the topics we've covered through our Connecting California series, today's is one of the most important. Racism is a complex issue. For some, it is uncomfortable. For others, it is a reminder of multi-generational trauma and injustice. Undeniably, it is a subject and a reality that cannot be ignored, especially when talking about digital inequity. The lack of access to devices, broadband, and digital literacy is too pervasive in poor communities of color to ignore the fact that race has unfortunately played a role in why we as a nation haven't solved this issue. Today, you'll hear from leading experts who have dedicated their careers to building racial equity via their digital equity efforts. Before we begin the discussion, Dr. Gary K. Michelson, founder and co-chair of the Michelson 20mm Foundation and the Michelson Center for Public Policy, will be sharing remarks and will introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Michelson.
Good morning. Thank you, Supervisor Mitchell, distinguished panelists, and you for joining us today for our 7th Digital Equity Conference. Over this last year, we have tried to meaningfully explore the many facets of digital inequity, looking for remedies and sharing best practices. In our past conversations, 2 broad groups have been identified as underserved. Rural communities, because there has not been sufficient population density / potential customer base in the eyes of the internet service providers to, from a strictly business perspective, justify the upfront infrastructural cost of laying fiber optic cable, and high orbiting satellites are inadequate to provide the quality of functionality required, and while limited, nevertheless expensive. The second group are the people who reside in dense urban areas, but which are nevertheless digital deserts. So who lives there? Generally people of little means, and it would appear predominantly people of color. Now, I for one have to suppose that these ISPs are equal opportunity money takers. So I'm not sure whether racism is a cause or just de facto the result. Regardless, COVID has underscored what our panelists today have understood for a long time, that the most troubling elements of this part of the digital divide appear to be rooted in systemic racial injustices that have deep roots and are pervasive. And whether we are considering infrastructure deployment or policy interventions, this is the right time to be having a conversation about the role of racism in the digital divide. I'm excited to learn alongside with you today. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's now my pleasure to introduce LA County Supervisor Holly Mitchell, who has tirelessly fought for justice and equality for all Californians, especially its most vulnerable communities. Supervisor Mitchell, over to you.
Good morning. I'm Supervisor Holly Mitchell, proudly representing LA County's 2nd District, and I'm honored to help welcome you to the Connecting California series hosted by the Michelson 20MM Foundation. Throughout my career, I fought to design programs and change policy to ensure equitable outcomes for our most overlooked communities. And so I'm excited that the Connecting California series has created this space for advocates, philanthropists, and policymakers to wrap our heads around complex issues. And few issues are more important to the health and wellness of our communities than digital inequity. Digital inequity, say that 3 times fast, means that our communities, disproportionately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, can't access the internet. It means that you can't access the digital world of learning and healthcare, that you can't work remotely or apply for most jobs and many public benefit programs. It impacts your ability and the ability of your kids to keep up in school. For our students, it means you can't attend online classes or complete your homework, and that means Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students will disproportionately fall behind, while white students continue to learn and excel. It's a vicious cycle of exclusion. The same injustice that's impacted our communities in the form of segregation, redlining, and systemic racism. In LA County alone, more than 182,000 households don't have a computer, and nearly 365,000 households lack home internet service. Across the second district, the disparities are highest among Black and Latinx populations. In some neighborhoods in my district, as many as 30% of the households lack an internet subscription in their home. We simply don't have a choice. We have to crush this digital divide, and we have to crush it expediently, like yesterday. I authored a motion that passed unanimously last month, just hours after the Senate voted to adopt a bipartisan infrastructure deal. I'm really proud of that. My motion sought to ensure that equity is at the center of how federal and state dollars are spent on digital inclusion, and demands an implementation plan at the county level to crush this divide in 4 months. We mean business. The digital divide is so stark in my community that we are proactively invested in a digital divide demonstration project. We've engaged both our public and private partners to close the divide in our communities of Linwood and Willowbrook. We intend to have this interdisciplinary approach and financial model for affordable broadband serve as a best practice for how to close the divide countywide. But frankly, that's not enough. We need all of our partners to weigh in. The California Public Utilities Commission was recently granted authority to hold debate on how they can facilitate closing this divide. This will include discussion on how we allocate resources to both rural areas without broadband and dense urban centers that lack affordable internet options. The CPUC rulemaking is a complex and technical exercise that inherently favors the existing broadband sector. So we need the community and your voice to balance the presence of private industry to ensure that the rulemaking favors our communities and accelerates our collective effort to crush this divide. So thanks again to the Michelson 20MM Foundation and to all the partners involved. You all have galvanized philanthropy on this issue, and it's changed the course of the conversation already. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and let's be bold and courageous, because this issue can't wait for us to show up any other way.
Bold and courageous indeed. Thank you, Supervisor Mitchell, for your leadership and your commitment to equity and justice. All of us at the Michelson 20MM Foundation are grateful for your work on this important issue and look forward to continuing to work with you, as you put it, crush the digital divide. Speaking of bold and courageous, for our panel discussion, we've invited some of the most bold and courageous leaders in the digital equity space to share their thoughts with us today. With us, we have Dr. Hernan Galperin, Associate Professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. an internationally recognized expert on internet policy and digital inequality. Dr. Galperin's research uses surveys, field experiments, and other quantitative methods to understand the determinants of broadband adoption and use, as well as how they are linked to the mechanisms of social stratification. Also with us is Rebecca Kawama, who serves as Economic and Digital Inclusion Program Manager for the City of Long Beach. In this role, she leads the city's economic and digital inclusion initiatives to ensure that low-income communities and communities of color in Long Beach have the opportunities, resources, and power they need to thrive economically. She does this through equitable, inclusive, and culturally competent practices, policies, and systems change efforts. We also have Dr. Tracy Morris, who is the Executive Director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University. As a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma, Dr. Tracy Morris is an expert in federal Indian policy, telecommunications, and digital culture. She has worked with Native American nations, tribal businesses, and Native American nonprofits. Additionally, Dr. Morris has advocated for digital inclusion at the Federal Communications Commission and on Capitol Hill as one of the nation's leading experts on the impact of digital inequity in tribal communities. Moderating our panel today is Deanne Cuellar. Deanne is the Texas State Program Director for Older Adults Technology Services and brings over a decade of experience in tech equity planning, strategy formation, and community organizing to her work. She serves as Mayor Ron Nirenberg's digital inclusion appointee to the City of San Antonio's Innovation and Technology Committee and is a sought-after advocate focused on fostering equitable internet access for all. This is truly a stellar panel. We are grateful for their leadership on this issue and happy to have them with us today. Deanne, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And give everybody an opportunity to turn on their cameras. Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have written up quite a few questions for this discussion, but I really do want it to be a discussion. So please feel free to give the longer answer to any of these questions today. But I'm going to start off today with a question I'd like to give everybody a chance to answer. To get us started, to highlight the areas of your expertise on this panel today, I'd like to ask every panelist this two-part question. Is there a particular story you are trying to tell today? And in solving the digital divide within poor communities of color, what is one thing that needs to resonate with as many people as possible today? And I'd like to start with Rebecca.
Sure, thank you so much. So again, my name is Rebecca Kawama, and I'm the Economic and Digital Inclusion Program Manager at the City of Long Beach. Thank you all for allowing me to be here today. And I'm so happy that you asked this question because I think it's important for us to look at this from a macro standpoint. And the first thing that I want to acknowledge and recognize, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that the digital divide continues to disproportionately affect Black and Brown communities, not only in Los Angeles County, but also in Long Beach. And one of the things that I've learned to understand just with my work around racial equity is understanding the history of this country and how the history has also impacted the digital divide. And so this is something that was mentioned as part of the introduction, and our country, as many of people may know, does have deep roots in institutional and systemic racism and oppression, and we have to be able to acknowledge that. And the government, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, even at the local government level, has played a significant role in creating and maintaining a lot of those inequities that we see, not only racial inequities, but also digital inequities as well. And a perfect example of that is redlining. And I think the most important thing that I want to convey to this entire group here is it's very important for us to first and foremost acknowledge the root causes of why we have these digital inequities. And it's important for us to understand the why as well. And so as we're looking at different digital inclusion strategies, solutions, best practices, we must be applying a racial equity lens as part of our work to truly be able to dismantle the institutional and systemic racism and oppression. So that is how I'll be framing my conversation today, and I'm looking forward to hearing additional information from my colleagues.
Thank you. Dr. Tracy Morris?
Chukma. Hello, everyone. I think I will follow that up by saying that I think in Indian country, it's a little bit different. I think let me give just a smidge of background. So there's 574 federally recognized Indian nations in the country, and 334 reservations in 35 states. California has one of the highest populations of Indian country. Believe it or not, LA itself has actually, well, it flip-flops every census between New York and LA, who has the highest urban Indian population. But one of the things to think about is that we're not, in urban situations, we're not clustering like other populations. So it doesn't necessarily become redlining so much as just simply indifference, complete indifference. Overarchingly, Indian country does not have access to broadband in the same way, especially on rural reservation areas or reserve areas or rancherias in California, for example. And we don't always work with the state the same way because of sovereignty. Tribes are sovereign nations, and we are part of the family of governments at with the United States. We need to be included at the table with cities and counties and towns and the federal government when we're talking about broadband inclusion in Indian country. And Indian country is just a term to encompass where our lands are. So when we think about these inequities, they are huge. And I'm not saying it's not racism. I'm not sure on redlining. And maybe y'all will convince me on that. But I think because of the way our population works and where we locate, it's a little different in that regard. But there are the issues of racism and colonialism and those sorts of things. But it's also just plain bang for the buck. Just like Dr. Michelson was saying at the beginning, it costs more money to go to these places. And that's a big part of it. So, with Indian country, I think the biggest message, going back to your question, Deanne, is what's the story? Digital inequities already existed before COVID, and I think we all can agree on that on this panel. And COVID just exacerbated and accelerated what was already coming. And in some ways, I think Indigenous peoples and people, and people of color were really the canary in the coal mine. It just made it so obvious. And in some instances, it became life and death. And that we certainly saw that on our tribal lands. And I can't speak to other communities, but we saw that there was no broadband, no infrastructure, no access to information for telehealth, no access to information about how the virus was spread. And therefore, we have to solve this issue, and we need to have a seat at the table in solving this issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Hernan?
Thank you, Deanne. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Let me start by thanking the Michelson Foundation, Miguel, Dr. Michelson, everyone for putting this really important event together. I'm a researcher, and I like to tell stories, but start from questions. And the question I try to answer in a lot of my research is whether the traditional patterns of underinvestment in poor communities of color in transportation, in health clinics, in education, in many other areas that have been documented, do they also exist for broadband? That is, are poor communities of colors also underserved in terms of broadband? And I use a combination of CPUC data, FCC data, census data to try to answer this question, and to also understand what is the interaction between income, race, education, all the factors that factor in the choices that are being made by the ISPs in where and how they invest. And the short answer, and the answer that unfortunately is what we find in our research is that resounding yes, that we see very clearly how the same patterns of underinvestment in other kinds of public infrastructure exist for broadband. They exist in terms of having fewer ISPs, there's less competition in these communities, there's less investment in fiber, which is the gold standard for broadband access. And I have a series of slides and graphs where I can go more in detail in showing you that it is about income, it is about race, but what really matters is the combination of poverty and communities of color. That's where you find the largest deficits in terms of broadband infrastructure.
Thank you for that. Rebecca, I wanted to circle back to you for this next question. How have you intentionally incorporated racial equity as part of your digital inclusion efforts at the City of Long Beach?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the one thing that I want to start off with is putting a shared language and definition out there. And this is how the City of Long Beach has defined racial equity. And for context, at the City of Long Beach, we participated in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And this is an organization that provides training to different types of entities throughout the country who are interested in being able to advance racial equity in their institutions. So their definition focuses on when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes. And the one thing that I want to mention is that when you look at race, you'll be able to see all the different inequities that exist. And even though here in the city we lead with race, we understand that there are many other intersections that people bring to the table. So this could include gender, socioeconomic status, and other indicators as well. And the reason why we do put race at the forefront is a racial equity lens does allow you to be able to address all those other areas of oppression when you're trying to solve for inequities. So I did want to put that context out there as we're looking at that. And the one thing that I love about racial equity is that it doesn't take a one-size-fits-all approach. So it's important for us to understand that when we're working with different communities, they all have very unique challenges, barriers, and lived experiences. So for me, I identify as Black/African American, so my experience is going to be different than those who may identify with Latinx population or our Cambodian population, which is the largest in Long Beach outside of Cambodia. So when we're talking about racial equity, it means that we're being intentional and being thoughtful and inclusive in all of our decisions, policies, practices, and programs. And it intentionally means that we are focusing on communities that are most in need and most impacted by the inequities that we're seeing. So some of our racial equity strategies that we've been implementing in the City of Long Beach include us looking at our data to figure out who is most impacted. Similar to what was shared, also making sure that we're including those that are most impacted as part of our decision-making process. So for example, we just recently developed a digital inclusion roadmap, and this is our strategic plan to be able to address the digital divide in Long Beach. And it was imperative that communities that are disproportionately affected by the digital divide have a seat at the table while we were creating that plan, and also are seen as experts as part of that process. So those are some of our strategies that we have been implementing, and I do want to uplift that community ownership is key. So it's important for us to see the community as key decision makers as part of this process as we're beginning to design all of our equity strategies and solutions. So I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of things in the chat, and then I'll close out for this question. One of the things I'm going to share is our digital inclusion roadmap, as I mentioned, and you'll be able to see how we incorporated the community's voices all throughout that document, and how we incorporated art and storytelling as a way for them to share what is their vision for digital equity and inclusion in Long Beach. In addition, as I mentioned, we utilize a racial equity lens. This is also a process that many individuals can utilize as they're developing their digital inclusion strategies or any type of issue strategy. So I will share a link to a toolkit that we utilize when we're applying a racial equity lens to our work.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate so much how you answered that question and how you've framed racial equity for this discussion today. Dr. Tracy Morris, we heard a couple of words in the openings, policies, rulemaking. From the grassroots to the Beltway, you've led this work to close the digital divide within communities of color. And due to the pandemic, there's an array of programs that are popping up as solutions. But I want you to have an opportunity to talk about what other processes that are going on to close the digital divide are thinking long-term for communities of color.
Thank you. So yes, we do work at the forefront of research and policy. We are part of the Arizona State University. So like my colleague, we are definitely doing research, original research and such in this arena. We are not a teaching unit, so we're not teaching at the current moment any students, although we employ students and we are fully Indigenous staff. You know, I've been working in this space, as you alluded, a long time, as have you as well. We've worked together on these issues, but you know, all of the work that we do at the American Indian Policy Institute and the work that I've done has always been rooted through one of the major organizations in Indian country, and that is the National Congress of American Indians. They are the collective voice of the 574 tribes. They bring together resolutions, asks of the federal government. They work with the federal government on the tribal budget every year, because we are, a lot of our tribal agencies are funded through the federal government. So as a result of what has happened with COVID, what we've seen, the federal government saw it. I mean, it was difficult to not see the impact. I mean, we all saw impacts, but being at a university, for example, I was hearing firsthand from students who'd lost all 4 grandparents in one weekend, kind of thing. And we were hearing that repeatedly, those kinds of stories. Navajo Nation was shut down. And us being the only organization in the country that is researching, that is doing this work on tribal broadband from an academic perspective, we were tapped immediately to be on all of these calls. And so what's ended up happening, the long and the short of it, is because we are tribal nations and we are part of the family of governments, and there is a trust responsibility through the treaty process, there's legislation, a myriad of legislation that has been directed at trying to bridge the digital divide in Indian country. Now there are some gaps. We have significant mapping issues. My colleague, I'm sure, understands the difficulties with using census data. It's not very granular. There can be problems with smaller communities. Mapping is extremely problematic in Indian country as well. So when we have that happening, and so that is one gap that we have to bridge. The other gap that we need to bridge is the idea of the middle mile. We've got, I mean, you can drop all satellites you want, but if there's no middle mile, there's still nothing to connect to. So it is an interesting dilemma we're in. And the middle mile in Indian country and in rural areas is really big, and some folks don't get that. You all are in California, you've got a lot of rural areas there. I know you all get it there, right? But so towards this, we have a number of federal agencies that have, federal agencies that have money. And in fact, I just co-hosted a panel a few minutes ago. I hopped off that for this call, I was talking with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which has $1 billion for tribal broadband connectivity in their fund. Applications just closed for that, but there were 5 billion in applications for the 1 billion. So that shows you how big the gap is there. We also do a lot of work with the USDA. Yes, the USDA has the Rural Utility Program. That's what got telephone across our country. Now it's getting broadband across the country. And they've been filling the gap for a very long time. And they have a series of robust programs that works in concert. We also have an Office of Native Affairs and Policy at the Federal Communications Commission. Right now, they're implementing the emergency broadband benefit. Many communities are eligible for that, but there is a tribal provision as well. And so we have a lot of programs. There's also been the 20 billion from coronavirus, that some of that is being used to do hotspots. I know at various nations, they're creating permanent hotspots to fill the gaps now, as well as working with states in filling those gaps in rural areas. And then there is the 100 million from the Coronavirus Projects Fund from the American Rescue plan of 2021. So there's a large infusion of money that we have, and then that's not including what we're hearing is $2 billion from the new infrastructure bill. But we have a lot of middle miles to fill. We still have issues with, we've had all these issues. One of the major issues is capacity. We don't have folks. We're such a small population. We don't have technically trained folks to even implement this. So you drop all this money in, and we still got that lack of technically trained folks. So it's creating capacity gaps now. But this is an unprecedented time, and that was what we were just speaking with tribal leadership. This unprecedented time is heartening. And it can do a lot to bridge that gap of the middle mile. And I do see your question. The middle mile is that, so cities are connected, your rural town might be connected, but there may be miles in there that is not connected in terms of middle mile. Think of it this way, there's connections along almost all the major highways, but how do you get out to those rural, smaller communities? That's where the disconnection is. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We have a tremendous, tremendous opportunity, and we are working with our colleagues to help tribes take advantage of this, provide the research they need. I look forward to reading more of my colleagues' research because there's not many of us doing broadband research. So I think that answers it in a really big nutshell, maybe a few nutshells.
Thank you. No, I love it. Thank you so much for explaining the middle mile. There is a lot of technology jargon that comes along with working on this issue. So please feel free to explain some of that. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Anand now. I was researching for today, and there's this video featuring your work where you said social inequalities are one of the biggest challenges of our time. We know that people of color are much more likely to experience homelessness. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about one of the biggest key takeaways you've learned from your work studying the digital divide in homeless populations.
Sure. Thank you, Deanne, for that question. We did a fairly a large study in among the homeless population in Los Angeles County, which unfortunately is I'm sure most of you are familiar, but it's a population of 50,000 plus. I haven't caught up on the latest numbers, but it's a very large population. And there's an very interesting parallel that I want to make here that we like to use in our work, because homelessness is not a stable condition. People are not homeless. They are experiencing homelessness. And for many it's transit. Unfortunately, for many it's not, but for many it's transit. People get in and out of homelessness. And it's, again, not a stable condition. And we like to think the same way, and I think the COVID pandemic has shown this, that connectivity is not a stable condition. People are connected at times, not connected at times. They have data caps that allow them to use so much broadband at times, but then they run out of broadband and they can connect at the perhaps at the public library, but only within a certain hours. And so we really conceive, and our work on homelessness has in some ways shed light on the same way that we think of homelessness. We like to talk more about housing instability. We've seen the same patterns of connectivity instability among not only the homeless population, but also much of the low-income population at large. In fact, one of the questions we're currently asking in our recent service is not only are you connected or not at home, but are you struggling to pay your bill? Did you have to make sacrifices to pay the bill? Have you had to disconnect for a few months because you couldn't afford the bill? So we're trying to understand these patterns of affordability, and think of the digital divide. And I say this repeatedly, that is really the word divide implies that there is connected and not connected, but really there's a gradation of connectivity, situations, and opportunities. And we ought to think more about how this graduation affect particularly low income and communities of color.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adan. Rebecca, I've got a question for you. And then I'd like to take an opportunity to look at those slides we mentioned. We hear the term data-driven pretty often nowadays. Data, smart data, can you tell us more about your work using data to drive solutions to close the digital divide within communities of color?
Sure, absolutely. I would like to provide an example of what we utilize as part of our CARES Act funding efforts. So the city of Long Beach last year was able to allocate $1 million to digital inclusion through CARES Act. And this was federal funding that we received from the federal government to help provide direct relief to many different communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so with this funding, this $1 million, I was able to work closely with community-based organizations to design different types of programs that would help address some of the key challenges and barriers communities were facing when trying to access and use the internet and computers during the pandemic. So one of the programs that we designed was to administer free hotspots and computing devices to those that qualified. And it was very imperative to us to ensure that it was going to those that were most disproportionately hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is also consistent with those that are disproportionately already affected by the digital divide prior to the pandemic hitting. So we had to be able to track which communities we were reaching and utilizing equity indicators that, as I mentioned earlier, would disaggregate by race/ethnicity, gender, zip code, language, and other relevant indicators that would best assess if these communities are most in need. So we were able to design a process that allowed us to collect these indicators and would literally track based on Long Beach residents disclosing their demographic information as they would submit applications for these free resources. And the one thing that I want to mention is it's very important for you to collect these equity indicators and to also disaggregate it, because when you're aggregating data, it doesn't tell you the true story of who you're serving. And that's how we're able to best assess if we're reaching communities most in need. So as a result, when we were administering these devices, we were able to learn at the conclusion and the end of our program that 90% of the communities that received our free hotspots and computing devices were of color, and that we were also able to serve communities that were disproportionately affected by digital divide based on zip code as well. So I do want to mention that it's important for us to look at the data as we're administering resources and services. And a couple of other things that I also wanted to mention as well that goes back into my initial point about applying a racial equity lens is also conducting a root cause analysis as part of your work. So it's very easy for us to look at data and draw our own assumptions and conclusions based on the data that we're looking at. So for example, one of the biggest data points that I like to look at is Black ownership in the city of Long Beach. So when we look at Black ownership, you'll be able to see that we have the lowest rates in Long Beach. And I think this is also consistent with LA County as well. And it's very easy for us to make an assumption as to why that is. But by conducting a root cause analysis, you're able to pull back the layers, almost like you're pulling back an onion, and see why that exists and understand the why behind the data and focus on solutions that get at that root. So for example, you'll be able to see that when you're looking at why Black residents in Long Beach have the lowest rates of home ownership, a lot of that is due to the discrimination that many of them face when they're trying to apply for loans. And when you continue to peel that back, you'll also be able to see that that's also a root of redlining as well. So it's important for us to look at data not only based on the surface, but also at the root level, because that will allow us to design solutions that ultimately get at the inequities that we're seeing.
Thank you so much. Dr. Adnan, I'd like to give you an opportunity to bring up those slides. And while you're doing that, there's a question that I think you might be able to answer parts of it in the chat. It's asking, in your research, in terms of underinvesting, do you have a graph or table on the budget of local governments? Oops, I lost it there. And a breakdown, B, of how local taxes are used, where local taxes go towards, and whether or not the community can vote for bills to steer these funds towards bridging the gap in the digital divide.
Thank you, Deanne. Let me start, since you're seeing the slides with with the graphs. So what we did here was we take the data from the California Public Utility Commission, the CPUC, which tells us what ISPs are serving which census blocks, and then we take the racial and income characteristics of those blocks, and then we build these models. And what we see in the panel or the graph on the left is that as poverty increases, the odds of there being more than one ISP, there being broadband competition, is going down fairly fast. So you can see the difference between those who are at the bottom 10% and at the top 10%, and they almost, if you're at the top 10%, you're almost twice as likely to be able to choose between one or more, two or more providers. And of course, having the ability to choose means better service, potentially lower prices. So we see that more low-income people of color live under basically a monopoly regime for broadband. And the second one is the same one that tells us that fiber investment, or the ability to buy fiber service, which again is the gold standard for broadband provision, is also lower as poverty increases at the census block level. So again, the bottom line is, if you're poor, you have fewer choices for broadband. Now we do the same in the next one for race. Can you, I'm not sure, thank you. That's the next one, where we do the same for race. In this case, we take the share of Black residents. And on the left, you can see that there is the same pattern, but not so steep, the decline, as the share of Black residents increases. However, what we do in the one on the right is that we split those census blocks between those who are low income, that is bottom 25%, and the rest. And when you do that graph, separating low income census blocks and not low income census blocks, you see that this is when the share of Black residents really matters in terms of availability of broadband competition. So the bottom line is, there is an interaction, there's a combination or a concentration effect that is particularly detrimental to low-income communities of color. This is where the interaction exists between being not just communities of color, but in particular those that are low-income and communities of color. And in the next one, we do the same for, so this is a different study where we look at Hispanic households, and here we're looking at the probability that students in K-12 students in households have the resources for remote learning. This is what we did during the pandemic. So whether you have a broadband connection and a computer, which is the minimal you need for remote learning. And you see that, of course, the higher the income, the higher the odds of having those resources. However, splitting between Hispanic and non-Hispanic households, we see that at the same level of income, non-Hispanic households have a higher probability of having those resources. So again, it's not just a story of income, it's a story of a combination of both income and racial inequities. For the question, we don't have data on I think municipal and local taxes and whether they're going to broadband initiatives or not. What I would say in this regard is I think we've seen more local communities trying to address this problem recently, and probably, of course, Rebecca can speak more to that. But what I would say is I think it is encouraging to see more and more local governments coming in and committing resources. I would highlight one of those efforts in Los Angeles, which is the South Bay Fiber Network, which I'm not sure if Long Beach is part, but I know many of the communities represented by Supervisor Mitchell are part of this. It's actually a middle mile network that's connecting a lot of the communities around Inglewood and Torrance and all the area on the South Bay. And this is the kind of local effort that could go a long way in addressing this issue.
Thank you so much. So I want to pivot back to you, Dr. Tracy Morris. At the beginning of the conversation, I mentioned, from the grassroots to the Beltway, and that was my way of saying that when we talk about solutions and building out the infrastructure to close the digital divide, these are conversations that we're not just having on the panel with the panel today. There's a local, state, and federal conversation that needs to take place. Can you talk a little bit more about the tribal solutions for deployment that you've worked on?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, and it goes right to what we've already been talking about local solutions. Community-centric solutions work. We know that, and whether it's rural or it's a city or a municipality, or we know our own communities is why. We know what those particularities are. And so with tribes, it's no different. And so being a part of that, we actually design our own solutions. On tribal lands, for example, when deploying a network, that has to go through not only federal government review, because remember, we don't own our lands. We can't collateralize our lands. That land is held in trust for us and we maintain it. So part of that review is going to be federal review, it's going to be tribal review, it's going to be historic and cultural preservation review. Before we'd ever say locate a tower, we would review the spot and things like that. So we are deploying our own networks because there are no providers of choice. There's not choice, there's not even providers in many of our communities. So there is no competition. So we provide our own networks. For example, here in Arizona, where I'm at, the Gila River Indian community, which is adjacent to this large city of Phoenix, is the provider of choice for its community. In other states, some of the tribes are providing overlapping services for communities around them. In Southern California, in and around Temecula, there's the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, which runs the Tribal Digital Village. They are providing community connections all around and some overlapping services, if I'm not mistaken, to surrounding communities. So it's community-based deployment with taking into account community requirements for anything cultural or anything like that, as well as what the community needs for its school or its library or whatnot. And like I say, those solutions I'm seeing work more and more in all sorts of communities.
Thank you so much. I want to turn the conversation a little bit towards advocacy, and I'd like to set it up by saying that there's a question in the chat that says, every time I open my bill, the price just, keeps getting higher. And I get asked a lot about what people can do about the changes in the cost of their subscriptions of the services that they receive. But besides that, answering that question, there's another question about how come ISPs just don't release the maps? Why aren't they more public? Where's the data? Who do they serve? And why is it so difficult, to find out where the internet is and it's not available? So I wanted to give you all each a chance to answer the question, what can communities do? How can they vocalize their concerns, about how they are being met as a customer or not being met? And I'd like to start with Rebecca.
Sure, that's a great question. And it is very difficult navigating all of that different aspects with trying to work closely with an internet service provider. And that is something that we as a city are trying to intentionally do, is continue to involve them as part of our conversations that we're having. We're very fortunate enough to have include them as part of our roadmap development process. The biggest challenge that I do want to mention when trying to access the internet, especially through an internet service provider, that we have seen is also language access. So many of our residents in Long Beach speak another language other than English inside of their household. And we have seen that not all of the internet service providers provide those real-time interpretation services for them to be able to communicate with an internet service provider in their language. So it's very important for those that are trying to continue to advocate for whatever resources and services they need to also work in alignment with community-based organizations. And I feel like that has been very fruitful for us in Long Beach, because these community-based organizations have the trust and relationships and also provide our communities with the tools to be able to support their advocacy. And that is something that we have done too when trying to outreach with community members that are disproportionately affected by the digital divide. I think it's also important for individuals to continue to express what these challenges and barriers are, even with their elected officials, continue to share where those pain points are with trying to access the internet and computers and where we could do better. Because of the pandemic, I'm excited to say there has been a lot of momentum that has been taking place, not only at the county level here in Los Angeles, but also at the state and federal level. So I think we can continue to push for some of these challenges and barriers that we're trying to address through those different options as well. But I think we need to continue to work in alignment with community-based organizations that can also help to push and drive those advocacy conversations as well.
Dr. Adnan or Dr. Tracy Morris, would you like to add to that?
Sure, I can comment two things, Dan, on your question. On the data question, I'm quite familiar. There is an ongoing effort at the FCC to significantly improve the type of data and the granularity of the data that the ISPs are required to report to the FCC. It's an ongoing effort. It's a long effort, but there's some money behind it, fortunately from Congress. So that's going to take time. It's an imperfect system, and it's going to take time to address the problems. The one thing I think it's still missing, or there's a few things missing in that effort, and one that I'm particularly concerned is that there's currently no provision for ISPs to inform and make public pricing. And I think we will have a much better sense of where service is available, but we will continue to be in the dark in terms of pricing. And I think that's a key component, because we know that the affordability is perhaps the biggest factor in terms of preventing low-income folks from connecting. And to your question about advocacy, I would say I think of it in the short term and in the medium and long term to address systemic change. So in the short term, I think what advocacy organizations are doing, but we need a lot more effort, is helping people sign up for existing low-cost offers. And in our research, we asked people, low-income folks, do they know about these offers? And typically 2/3 of households that are low income that would qualify for the offers are unaware of these offers. The ISPs are not particularly eager to promote them. So there's a gap in terms of the availability of some solutions for low-income folks, and the fact that also for a number of language reasons and literacy reasons, all kinds of reasons, people are just not taking advantage enough of those offers, including EBB, which also is 3/4 of households are unaware of even EBB, the federal effort. And on the long-term systemic change, I think advocacy organizations are key to keep pushing for systemic change to the system. I think EBB and low-cost offers are short-term band-aids. We need much more systemic thinking and change. And of course, advocacy organizations can have an important role there.
Thank you so much. Advocacy, Dr. Morris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to advocacy and the data both. You know, on the advocacy level, yes, there are. I have to agree that these are short-term fixes. We're plugging holes in a leaky boat as opposed to sustainable solutions at this point. I think you know, they like to tout a program like EBB, but I don't think in the end it's going to impact our communities like it should. I certainly, I don't know about you all, but I've tried to fill one out for my dad, and I haven't been able to figure it out. And I work in this arena. I haven't been able to get him qualified. The provider, you know, puts the information straight up there, but the qualification part and the kind of documentation you need, if you're doing that on a public access computer, it's not safe. So, I mean, there's some issues with these programs that they are touting as solutions. And it's not going to be a long-term solution. Of course, the EBB is only going to last till the money runs out, and then it will presumably transition into a lower a sustainable program that's a lot less help on that. So, you know, we have issues with the advocacy part because we don't have the number of advocacy groups in Indian country to go out there. We don't work directly with constituents, so we're trying to get information to like Indian centers and those sorts of folks that are working, or organizations that are working with the safety net programs for Indian country. But there are language issues, absolutely. There are issues with just the technology itself. It's not a solution. We need a sustainable solution. In terms of the data itself, the data is very flawed. I think we understate that. It is absolutely flawed. And we know specifically on tribal lands, even the FCC acknowledges that the data is significantly flawed and overestimated. And we know that that's because the data is proprietary. We asked the carriers on a form to report what they serve. And if they serve one household in a zip code, they consider it served even if they're not serving it. And that's a problem. I think we advocate at AIPI, and certainly with tribal organizations like National Congress of American Indians, we advocate for independent data that's not coming from carriers, because only then are we ever really going to get a handle on how significant the divide is, I think, personally. And, you know, towards all of this, I think the one thing we've danced around is broadband access and affordability should be a social determinant of health. It should be in that category, period. If you don't have it, you don't even exist. You don't even exist. In a lot of ways, you can't do taxes, you can't apply for school, you cannot apply for a job. I mean, you don't exist. And so I think if we started to include that data in social determinants of health, it would go a long ways towards the people we're missing when we talk about this. Just my thoughts.
Thank you so much for bringing up social determinants of health. That was my next question. You know, earlier before I got on for today's panel, you know, the Michelson Foundation published something that I read, and they were talking about how Latinx communities were less likely, based on the research, to go online for health information or to submit online forms. So can you talk a little bit more about how the work that we need to do to make sure that the digital divide, you know, becomes a social determinant of health, that we talk about that more? Dr. Morris?
You know, I don't have an answer to how we make sure. I think we've got to just be talking about it in public spaces like this to begin with. And then we've got to talk to, I guess off the top of my head, I would say talking to our local representatives and lawmakers, but then we've got to be talking to the researchers. I don't know the process to get it as a social determinant of health, but it's just starting to be talked about as one. So I think that that's something, in all actuality, I would say we should define it for ourselves instead of let somebody define how we do it. But I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, I'd like to also, pivot to Rebecca and let you talk about this. In San Antonio, in the city of San Antonio, when I was recently talking with elected leaders on social determinants of health, 80% of the people we've lost due to the pandemic were older adults. And, that data we estimate 42% or more didn't have access to the internet. Would you like to take a chance on this question? Do you want to talk about social determinants of health and digital divide?
Sure, absolutely. And thankfully, my background is in health administration / public health. So this is something that I've also just been trying to understand with the intersectionality of all of the different issue areas that come up. So I think the biggest thing for us to be able to understand is how the digital divide ultimately impacts all of the different areas of our lives. And I think that's where we're getting at with the social determinants of health. So when we talk about the social determinants of health, that can include everything from economic stability, education, food access, healthcare systems. And it's very, very interesting to see how, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, how navigating, accessing the internet and computers definitely shifts every single aspect of our lives. So for example, the digital divide, we saw a huge, huge shift with many students having to transition to doing school at home. And that also proposed many issues and barriers. We also saw many issues with individuals trying to access healthcare services. I know, for example, my provider did transition many of our appointments to online. So we saw a huge increase in telehealth as well. So I think it's important for us to understand that the digital divide does intersect in many different other issue areas, and you need to be able to understand the systems that are in play and not have a one sector approach to the issue. So for example, when we're trying to craft solutions here in Long Beach to be able to advance digital equity and inclusion, I cannot just isolate the digital divide in one issue area. You need to be able to understand all of the different systems. So the healthcare system, the education system, the criminal justice system, and all of the inequities that exist in those systems, because each of those systems overlap. So I can't just look at digital inclusion without looking at education. I need to bring in those stakeholders and those communities that are affected there. I can't look at digital inclusion without also looking to see how it plays a role in our economic system. So it's important for us to understand the intersectionality of all of those systems and ultimately look at solutions that have the option to be able to support and address multi-system inequities that exist. So it is a lot, and I think it definitely requires you bringing multiple cross-sector partners to the table and understanding the intersectionality of how all of those come into play, and making sure you're focusing on a systems change approach while doing it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we talk about systems level changes a lot. So I wanted to talk about systems level changes for a moment. I have this question, what does a world on the other side look like? I mean, have you all as panelists thought about that? Looking in, you had a moment to look towards the future. Your research, is on the forefront today, but it's being put into action. We're on the other side of the bridge, or the bridge, we took the bridge down, it doesn't exist anymore. We've closed as many tech equity gaps as we could. What does the future look like? Have you all imagined what your goals and actions look like? Dr. Adnan?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Thank you, Deanne. I think I am optimistic that the pandemic has really exposed some of the flaws in the system, some of the inequities that could no longer be ignored. I think the pictures of the kids trying to do homework in parking lots in the middle of freezing weather, and so many other stories like that, just were not, you could not ignore those images. And I think it did galvanize policymakers, foundations, philanthropy, and advocates, and everybody around this issue. So I think both Tracy and Rebecca mentioned that there's a lot of funding coming into play already, and there's hopefully more on the way with the infrastructure package and other sources of funding. Now this is my optimist, the part of me that optimist. The part of me that's a little more less optimist is I think we need to get it right this time. Because we've had money come in the billions of dollars for rural broadband, and we've had money come in for digital literacy. It's not the first time we do this. Perhaps the sheer volume is bigger, but we've done this before, and with underwhelming results. So I'm optimistic, but I'm concerned that we have to get it right this time. And I concur here, for example, with in many ways with Dr. Morris, is saying that let's think not just short-term fixes to the leaking boat. And EBB is one example of that, because in many ways it is rewarding ISPs who are not competing, who are not investing, simply paying them the difference between what consumers can afford and what they want to charge consumers. So we are in many ways rewarding private sector companies that really shouldn't be rewarded for what they're doing. They should really be held to their commitments to invest more in low-income communities, in rural areas, and we should hold them to those standards. So again, I'm optimistic with so much energy coming into the space, but we need to get things right this time.
Thank you. Dr. Tracy Morris, optimistic. Have you thought about being on the other side?
No, I've thought about how to get there and I've got some plans, but I haven't. I mean, I have more optimism. Well, I guess I do have optimism because over the years that I've been doing this, the last 13, 14 years that I've been doing this, I have seen the changes, incremental albeit, but changes that have been able to be made by being present in the policy sphere, by doing the research that needs to be done. I have seen the changes. There's some of them are really small, but some of them are big. We've got 1 billion for tribal broadband, not including all the other broadband that's out there right now. Now, granted, we had 5 billion in applications, so that talks to the need, but to see that happening, I didn't think in my lifetime I'd see somebody in a federal agency that's indigenous. And it's hard for me to even talk about that in a way that, these are firsts for us in Indian countries. So I do have optimism. That being said, this is a big divide, and it's, that divide is physical in terms of land, and so I think there's a lot that needs to be done because our population is so small and has such specificity in terms of dealing with the federal government. And so I do think it's going to take time. A lot of time. I think I'll work on it the rest of my life. I will, and hopefully I'll train the next generation. That's my real goal, being in university, is getting that next generation going. I honestly think that in some ways, I really think this is a new and emerging field, digital inequity, whether it's the policy end of it or the implementation of it or the research. I'm really starting to think about it as something much more comprehensive than just broadband. And I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm putting a plan into place. So I have optimism. I think if I didn't, I couldn't do the work. So, but I don't know what it'll look like. I don't imagine. I know I can get there, but stuff always changes. So I'm open.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Rebecca, are you thinking about what the future looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to think about it also in terms of what I've heard and what the community's vision is for digital equity and inclusion. And that is something that we we're trying to also share and tell as part of our roadmap development process. And some of these, visions that the community shared are just something so simple, but it's so important. And I want to uplift that. I remember somebody shared that they just want to be able to walk to a place where they can be able to utilize the computer, something that's walking distance, where they can just simply call their internet service provider and not have to worry about not having someone speaking their language. So some of these simple aspects that they have created as part of this vision, I think is something that I see as part of our greater digital equity strategy. So I think it's about us continuing to understand how the community visions and sees digital equity and what we can continue to do to drive that. That is something that I try and put at the core, because it's very easy to get lost in the weeds when you're constantly doing the work and forgetting what the community's needs and wants are. So that's something that I continue to uplift as I look at the collective vision for digital equity and inclusion, and also recognizing that there are 3 components of digital inclusion. So recognizing that obviously we need to continue to focus on broadband, but we also need to make sure that we're promoting computer literacy training as well, and making sure that that's available in multiple languages. And then also focusing on the technology piece, and also making sure that we have technical support for all of those 3 aspects as well. So I think that should be also part of our collective vision as we're striving for digital equity and inclusion.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's not a lot of good that we can point to that's come out of the pandemic. And, before the pandemic, almost everybody that worked on this issue knew of each other, or, knew who we were, across geographies. And if there's one positive thing that I can say on this issue that's come out of the pandemic era is that the field is ever expanding, and there's more and more advocates coming to the table, and we've got a big fight and a big issue to work on. So there's no shortage of work. We've got time for one more question for a round robin, and then we're going to get to these Q&A. And also, please don't forget to look in the chat. There's so many great tools and resources that are being shared. It's wonderful to see that. And then there's also lots of really positive feedback that's coming back from people that are attending this event today. The last question is, in that same article that I mentioned earlier, there was this phrase that also caught my attention. It said, federal and state investments in broadband infrastructure open the possibility for innovative approaches to connecting Black and Latinx communities. Despite progress, vigilance is required as industry is lobbying to maintain its monopoly on what should be a public utility and a human right. So I'm going to start with Dr. Anand. Public utility and human right?
Yes, I would perhaps lean on the lobbying that you mentioned, which is exactly what's happening. That the industry loves in many ways loves these bills and this funding coming, the infrastructure bill and others, because it would pay for them to lay down infrastructure that they would own in places that they don't see the economic return. So the government will just pay for them to do something that they would perhaps not do it on their own, but it's really not. I do get frustrated because of the as I said, the way in which some of this funding is being directed is an old recipe that has not really worked to connect low-income communities of color. It just hasn't. Or it hasn't. I should nuance that, saying it has not connected folks to the extent of the funding that are available, because we've spent billions of dollars and for very little return in terms of truly affordable internet in places where it's most needed. So I do, again, my concern is, yes, lots of really good news on funding, but can we find community-oriented, community-driven solutions that are not just more and more of the same old recipe?
Thank you for that. Dr. Tracy, would you like to add?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. And I think you're absolutely right. These are old subsidy models that been tried and, they've been doing them forever and they haven't moved the needle the way that they could have. One of the ways we're seeing some innovating funding models is happening in Indian country, and that is with this $1 billion from Department of Commerce. That is earmarked to go directly to tribes instead of to carriers to support tribes. So that hopefully is the new model, or could be a replicated good new model. How they implement that, we have yet to be seen. I mean, they've just got the applications in, but that's new. So we're definitely hopeful in Indian country that works. And if that works, that may be a model for changing that and moving the needle. So as far as human right, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. But, I think that's just way too simplistic. Water is a human right too, but that's being monetized. So, it's kind of, but how about that?
Yeah, I agree. It's but. Rebecca, would you like to add to that question?
Nothing further to add, but I think the simple answer to your question is yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, we've got quite a few questions from the people that are tuning in today. One of them is for you, Dr. Tracy Morris. How is the federal landscape changing research on tribal broadband?
Oh, I think there's, there is a need for more research in Indian country, and there's a need for more researchers and more folks going into this field of research. I think that having a seat at the table, like I think I was saying earlier, is dramatic, all of this, and it's unprecedented, but we still don't have the capacity yet. According to the old census, we're 2% of the population. I think it's 4 now, but I haven't read all the details. But if we're 2% of the population and less than 0.1% of us get a higher degree, and that doesn't include master's or doctorate, then we don't have the capacity to be able to do the kind of research on our communities that we need. And there are issues too about data sovereignty and the proprietariness of tribal specific data as well. So the federal landscape is changing, but there's just not enough actual research on tribal communities because we are such a small population. It skews the way that the statistics are done. That's why Pew doesn't do studies about connectivity and tribal broadband. That's why census is skewed, because it's, larger land-based tribes with larger populations, nothing under 50,000. We have many tribes that are 3, 5, 10,000. So what we need is more researchers going into these fields. We need our own folks in there, and we need partners. I have terrific partners on my board that I work with. I cannot wait to reach out to Hernan and see what he's doing and see what we can partner on, because I think there's lots of opportunity there as well, especially with California tribes. So the federal landscape is ever changing, but we need to drive more research on tribal broadband, but our institute is it. We're the only ones doing it right now. So if you know somebody out, if there's somebody out there who wants to go into tribal broadband research, look me up, please.
Thank you so much. We haven't talked a whole lot about older adults, so I really like this question. Thinking about the growing older adult population, how are advocacy efforts for addressing the digital divide being integrated into age-friendly efforts such as the Master Plan on Aging and Purposeful Aging Los Angeles? Do we have a panelist that would like to address that one?
Well, what I could provide, Deanne, is I was trying to look for some of the data that we have on older adults connectivity. What is interesting is that I think, or rather our data shows that even though older adults continue to be the least connected age group, they have jumped the most in terms of connectivity throughout the pandemic, which is rather to be expected. They are the group that was most at risk for COVID and stayed at home and had to transition and had to learn to do so much of their daily activities through a computer, a tablet, or a smartphone. So we've seen a fairly large jump in the connectivity for this group, which is encouraging. quite a bit of telehealth take up as well in this group, but they still lag and there's still more to be done. And I know several organizations, including one that I work quite closely, the CETF, the California Emerging Technology Fund, is doing work in this population and just received a new grant because a lot of the work with this population is not just provision of device and connectivity, it's literacy, is really working with them to provide the services they need. We have to remember, people don't get broadband just to get broadband. They get broadband to be able to go online and participate in remote learning, in telehealth, talk to their kids, grandkids, etc. So, and that needs to be a part of the effort to connect the older adult population.
Thank you so much for that. And I just dropped a link for everyone. There's agingconnected.org. I encourage you all to visit the landing page for the organization I work for, Older Adults Technology Services. We also have resources about older adults and the intersection of technology. I'm not sure who this question, who this is for. I think, Rebecca, I think you might be able to answer this one. It says that schools and school districts have provided parents with meals during the pandemic. However, when it came to ISP access, and I think they're asking payments and subsidies for internet services, that those services were not available or scarce. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and I can't speak to which school district you're perhaps referring to, since I don't have any context there. So I will go ahead. I did want to expand on the older adults question, and then I can touch a little bit more about how we can be a lot more intentional with doing internet services outreach. So I did want to uplift that the computer literacy and just digital literacy as a whole is very important, especially for older adults. And just simply providing the technology and the connectivity is not enough. In Long Beach, we saw that even when we were administering hotspots and computing devices, many of our older adults still needed some additional assistance to have the confidence to be able to turn on their devices and utilize them for day-to-day tasks. So I do want to mention, and this goes back to the equity perspective, that you need to be able to understand the different unique needs that every community has. And I would say that just from our experience with working closely with older adults and the advocacy groups that support them, that we do need to be a lot more intentional by providing additional one-on-one support, so that way they feel confident when utilizing their devices. And in regards to the next question that you asked, we definitely need to do a better job, I think, as multiple different entities that are engaged in this effort on finding different connecting points to be able to help individuals sign up for low-cost internet, especially in spaces where we know they'll be able to qualify. So we are very fortunate enough to have an organization called Human IT. They're a nonprofit digital inclusion organization that literally addresses the entire spectrum of digital inclusion, everything from connecting residents to low-cost internet, also providing low-cost devices, and also doing digital literacy training. And so it's important for us to ensure that we have different touch points, whether individuals are, for example, picking up their children from school. Is there individuals there that can help them sign up for low-cost internet? Even at laundromats, that was one of the areas that it could be a key outreach area to be able to connect individuals. So I think we need to get a lot more strategic with what types of community outreach opportunities are out there. We saw a lot of that creativity with the 2020 census, especially because the COVID-19 pandemic shifted that. And a lot of our community partners had to get creative with how we're outreaching to communities. So I'm hoping that we can use similar strategies to that as we continue to promote low-cost internet access and broadband adoption.
Thank you so much. I really like this question because, as someone who is born and raised in a, community of color, myself, art and storytelling is a big part of the work that we do. And I think this question could be answered by all three, but I'm probably going to start with Dr. Tracy on this one. It's kind of long. Give me a minute. I really appreciate the mentions of art and storytelling as vital practices in community work. One thing that has been bugging me as a newer nonprofit staff member is, while I look forward to conducting this interrogative research on my own, for example, studies and resources, I'm conflicted about using personal narratives from community members and clients. Do you have any advice for someone who both wants to, one, discourage general assumption by potential donors, and two, avoid using experiences too much?
So we don't use testimony or direct stories at all. I work for a university, and that is a human subjects review issue. But I find that, I mean, I can tell general stories, but data tells stories. I can tell a story with data that is just, I think, just as effective. We don't use any personal testimony stories at all in the work we have done. I think that it's much more personally for the work we're doing, with our audience being specifically lawmakers, tribal leaders, and then academics and such, and organizations, other community organizations. I feel that our work is best served if we are talking about the data, lack of data, and if we are bringing to bear the stories that come out of the data. And I also do think a lot in terms of making sure that people can take away certain talking points. I always think specifically about talking points, facts about tribal sovereignty, facts about the trust relationship, a few facts about the connectivity issues. Those go a lot longer of a way towards telling a story. I feel like that's how I run AIPI. Other organizations run very different, but we're not a grassroots organization working with constituents on the ground. We're working with lawmakers, we're working with researchers and academics and other organizations that need data. So I think the question about storytelling is how you think about storytelling. There's a myriad of ways to do that. And I also think about it's about who your audience is as well. And it's also about the respect for the individual. At a certain point, too much of the personal narrative, especially in a negative way, can become poverty porn. And I don't do that. We don't do that. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Thank you. We have time for one more answer on this question. Dr. Hernan, would you like to add anything?
Sure, perhaps just briefly, I'm going to put in the chat something that we did, but really it was something that our partners did. LA CAN, which is a well-known advocacy organization in Skid Row. We work with them, and as a way to promote the work that they were doing on connectivity in Skid Row, they put together this bicycle with a card that helped people charge their phone. In Skid Row, one of the big problems is people can't charge their phone because they don't live anywhere. Well, they live on the streets rather. So there's nowhere to charge a phone. So I think more than storytelling, this is sort of the sort of a performance, if you will, a sort of a performative intervention where they would go around with this card and just show how really this type of intervention what was needed. So again, more than a testimonial, this was more of a performance, if you will, but really caught attention for a lot of folks. So I encourage you to look. And again, this is not something that we did, but all the credit goes to LA CAN, which put this together.
And if I may, I'd like to just quickly chime in because that question may have been directed to my piece actually. And I would say, yeah, definitely similar to what Dr. Morris has uplifted. I definitely do believe it depends on who your audience is. So for us, we find storytelling as very, very fundamental because the data alone that we get from the American Community Survey does not tell us anything. All we're able to see is, information based on disaggregated data, but it doesn't tell us what those key challenges and barriers are that our communities in Long Beach, and I'm speaking in context of Long Beach, of what those communities are experiencing. So for us, we find that information to be very vital because that helps us craft solutions that will get directly at those challenges and barriers that community members have shared with us. And we're very intentional as well with our approach by not looking at it from a deficit standpoint, by making sure we're telling the story, but we're also looking at what are some of the key assets that the community is also bringing to the table as well. So for us, through our audience, it's important for us to tell those stories because that also allows us to get additional funding as well. So that storytelling and art making was definitely something that worked well for us. Again, it may not work well for other communities as has been expressed as part of this panel. And the one thing that I want to mention is that we have to be very intentional with it as well. So working closely with partners that allow us to do it in a space that will ultimately resonate with a positive impact and not do more harm than good. So I just wanted to provide that context as well, that definitely it depends on your audience and it has to work for your community. Some communities it doesn't work well for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I'd like to turn it back over to Miguel.
Thank you so much, Deanne, and thank you to all our speakers for the very insightful conversation. Just a heads up to everyone in the audience, you will get a follow-up email soon, aggregating all the resources that were shared. I counted easily over a dozen, which is fantastic. Really points to how fruitful our conversation was. We heard everything from the importance of involving nonprofit organizations in your digital equity work to uplift that community voice. We heard about the need to classify access to broadband as a social determinant of health because of its intersectionality. And we heard about the importance and really the need of for more research, especially in tribal communities, to get adequate data to fully tackle digital inequity. So thank you, thank you. Race and digital inequity, the impact on poor communities of color was presented by the Michelson 20mm Foundation in service of advancing digital equity for all students and families. We want to thank our foundation partners, the California Community Foundation, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and Southern California Grantmakers. We'll post the recording of today's discussion on our YouTube channel, the Michelson 20mm Foundation, by tomorrow. The video will include links in the description so that you may join the Connecting California LinkedIn group, a dedicated space to foster collaboration in California to advance digital equity and close the divide faster and together. If you or your organization want to become part of our digital equity work, please reach out to me personally at miguel@20mm.org. You can also stay engaged by signing up for our newsletter at 20mm.org. To receive news and updates about Connecting California, as well as our other events and programs. Thank you so much again for taking the time to join us. Have a great rest of the day.